Some war films were not just stories. They were warnings. Hidden beneath uniforms and medals were truths that made powerful institutions uneasy. These British war classics did more than entertain. They questioned command, exposed cracks in leadership, and echoed fears that even U.S. generals could not ignore. Hollywood did not shout them down. It did something quieter. It let them fade. Stay with us, because the deeper you go, the more unsettling the truth becomes. Number 15. The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, 1943. A war film that refuses to salute on command. This story does not march in step with patriotic fantasy. It walks straight into the heart of British military pride and quietly dismantles it. The old guard officer at its center believes in honor, rules, and tradition. The film asks a dangerous question. What happens when those beliefs become outdated in a brutal modern war? Opposition did not come quietly. Winston Churchill himself tried to block it. That alone tells you how threatening the message felt. The film suggests that rigid leadership can become a liability. It paints war as a space where adaptability matters more than pride. Now, twist this through the Cold War lens. American military culture at the time was built on authority, discipline, and image. A film like this did not just challenge Britain. It echoed uncomfortably across the Atlantic. While no general stood at a podium to denounce it directly, the sentiment was clear. Films that question command structures are dangerous to morale. Hollywood noticed. Distribution was cautious. Promotion was restrained. Because once audiences start questioning the men in charge, the illusion cracks. And this film does exactly that. Quietly, relentlessly. Number 14, King and Country, 1964. This is not a courtroom drama. It is a moral execution. A young soldier stands accused of cowardice. But the deeper truth is far more unsettling. He is not being judged for fear. He is being sacrificed to preserve authority. The film strips war down to its coldest mechanism. Discipline over humanity, order over justice. Every frame feels like an accusation aimed at the system itself. It exposes how military structures can protect themselves at the cost of individual lives. During the 1960s, this message hit a nerve. The Vietnam War was escalating. Questions about military ethics were growing louder in the United States. A film like this did not just belong to British history. It mirrored contemporary fears. There is no verified speech from a U.S. general condemning it, but the discomfort was real. Military institutions do not welcome stories that suggest innocent men are executed to maintain control. That idea spreads doubt, and doubt is the enemy of command. Hollywood treated the film carefully. Limited exposure, minimal push. Because once audiences see war as a machine that consumes its own soldiers, the heroic narrative becomes harder to sell. Number 13. The Charge of the Light Brigade, 1968. This is where spectacle turns into satire. A famous military disaster is retold not as glory but as arrogance dressed in uniform. Orders are given with confidence. Men ride into death with discipline. And the film quietly exposes the truth behind it. Leadership failed them. The tone is sharp, almost mocking. That is what made it dangerous. It does not simply show a mistake. It suggests a pattern. Authority figures making decisions detached from reality. Soldiers paying the price. Now, place this in 1968. The Vietnam War dominates global headlines. Trust in military leadership is already eroding. In that climate, this film feels less like history and more like commentary. Though there is no historical evidence about U.S. general publicly attacks the film, but the alignment is impossible to ignore. Military institutions were already pushing back against anti-war narratives. A film like this feeds that fire. Hollywood understood the risk. Promotion never matched its scale, because satire cuts deeper than drama. It lingers, it provokes, and once the audience starts laughing at authority, the control begins to slip. Number 12. Overlord, 1975. This is not the war story audiences were trained to expect. There are no triumphant speeches, no heroic charges framed as destiny. Instead, the film follows one ordinary soldier drifting toward D-Day with a quiet certainty that he will not survive. That single idea changes everything. War is no longer victory, it becomes inevitability. The imagery feels almost documentary in tone. Real archive footage blends with fiction until the line disappears. The result is unsettling. It does not glorify the invasion. It reduces it to a machine that moves forward regardless of the men inside it. That kind of portrayal does not inspire. It lingers like a warning. Across the Atlantic, the timing could not have been worse. Military narratives in the United States were still trying to recover from Vietnam. Stories built on sacrifice without triumph were not welcome. A film that suggests soldiers are simply carried toward death, without meaning cuts directly against institutional messaging. What followed speaks louder than any speech ever could. The film struggled to secure meaningful distribution in the American market for years. Not banned, not attacked publicly, just quietly sidelined. Because some films do not need controversy to disappear. They only need to make the wrong people uncomfortable. Number 11, Aces High, 1976. The sky has never looked this unforgiving. Fighter pilots take off with confidence and return with silence. The film strips away the romance of aerial combat and replaces it with a brutal cycle. Young men arrive full of belief. Days later, they are gone, replaced without ceremony. At the center stands a commanding officer who knows exactly what is happening. He drinks, he hardens, he sends the next group into the same fate. This is not heroism. It is survival within a system that demands sacrifice again and again. The real enemy is not the opposing force. It is the machinery of command that keeps the cycle moving. By the mid-1970s, this portrayal hit a raw nerve. The United States was emerging from Vietnam with deep scars. Public trust in military leadership had fractured. A film that openly suggests young soldiers are being fed into a system without purpose does not rebuild that trust. It tears it further apart. No dramatic confrontation was needed. The reaction unfolded in quieter ways. Limited push, muted visibility. Because stories like this do not fail by accident. They are allowed to fade. And when they do, the message fades with them, until someone brings it back and asks the same question again. Who was really in control? Number 10, The Hill, 1965. Heat crushes everything in this story. Sand burns the skin. Authority burns deeper. A group of soldiers are sent to a punishment camp where discipline is not about correction. It is about breaking the human will. They climb an artificial hill again and again until bodies fail and minds fracture. At the center stands a system that feeds on obedience. Orders are followed without question. Cruelty is justified as necessary. The film does not show an enemy across the battlefield. It shows one within the ranks. That shift is what makes it dangerous. War is no longer about survival against opposition. It becomes survival against your own command. For audiences conditioned to see the military as a source of order, this narrative lands like a shock, especially in a world still processing Vietnam. Images of authority pushed to extremes were already circulating. This film adds another layer. It suggests that the structure itself can become the threat. No loud rejection, no headlines, just a quiet distancing. Because when discipline starts to look like abuse, the image of control weakens. And once that image weakens, the entire story begins to unravel. Number 9. Play Dirty, 1969. War here has no clean edges, no noble purpose, only shifting loyalties and hidden motives. A British commando unit is sent on a mission that feels less like strategy and more like manipulation. Orders change. Truth bends. Survival depends on deception rather than courage. The film strips away the idea of honorable warfare. Officers lie, soldiers adapt, morality becomes flexible. Every decision feels compromised. This is not the battlefield audiences were taught to admire. It is a shadow version, where outcomes matter more than integrity. Release this during the Vietnam era, and the parallels become impossible to ignore. Trust in leadership was already fragile. Stories of hidden agendas were no longer fiction. They were part of public conversation. A film that reflects that reality does not entertain. It reinforces doubt. The response followed a familiar pattern. No open confrontation, no official condemnation, just a cooling of enthusiasm. Because when war starts to look like a game of manipulation, the audience begins to question every victory they have ever been shown. Number 8. Oh, What a Lovely War, 1969. It begins like a celebration. Bright colors, songs, smiles. Then the numbers start to appear. Casualties rise with every verse. Laughter fades into something colder. The film turns war into a performance and then exposes the cost behind the spectacle. This is satire with a blade. It does not attack directly. It invites the audience to enjoy the show before revealing what the show really means. Generals become distant figures. Decisions feel detached from the lives they affect. The contrast is impossible to ignore. Arriving at the height of global unrest, this approach cuts deep. Anti-war sentiment was already spreading. Protest movements were growing louder. A film that transforms mass death into a staged musical does not soften the message. It sharpens it. What follows is not outrage. It is hesitation. Because satire is harder to fight than accusation. You cannot easily defend against laughter. And once the audience begins to see war as theater, the illusion of control begins to dissolve. Number 7. The Guns of Navarone, 1961. A mission is planned with precision. A small Allied team must destroy massive enemy guns blocking a naval route. On the surface, it feels like a classic war objective. Clear target, clear purpose. Clear victory waiting at the end. But the deeper the mission goes, the more unstable that certainty becomes. The team is not united. Leadership is questioned. Decisions are challenged at every step. Each man carries a different belief about what the mission means and how it should be carried out. Trust becomes fragile. Authority is no longer absolute. It must be earned moment by moment. This is where the film shifts from action to something more revealing. It shows that even in high-stakes operations, command is not always clean or unquestioned. Orders can be doubted. Leaders can be resisted. Success depends on negotiation as much as discipline. Viewed through a broader lens, this creates quiet tension. Military systems rely on cohesion and obedience. A story that highlights internal conflict and hesitation does not reinforce that image. It complicates it. It suggests that victory is not driven by perfect command, but by flawed individuals adapting under pressure. There was no need for loud rejection. The effect works differently. The film thrives as entertainment, yet its deeper implications remain underplayed. Because once audiences begin to see cracks inside elite operations, the myth of total control starts to weaken, and that is a far more difficult idea to manage. Number 6. Went the Day Well? 1942. It begins like a quiet English village afternoon. Calm streets, familiar faces. Nothing feels out of place. Then the truth slips in without warning. The enemy is already inside, disguised, patient, waiting. What follows is not a battlefield clash. It is something far more unsettling. Trust collapsing from within. The film does something rare for its time. It removes the safe distance between war and home. There are no front lines here. No clear separation between soldier and civilian. Ordinary people are forced into impossible decisions. Neighbors turn into threats. Survival depends on instinct, not training. This shift carries a deeper implication. If the enemy can blend in so completely, then the idea of control becomes fragile. Military strength depends on clear lines and defined roles. This story erases those lines. It suggests that war cannot always be contained or predicted. That uncertainty lingers long after the final scene. Viewed through a wider lens, this kind of narrative does not reinforce confidence. It introduces doubt, not loud enough to provoke open resistance, but strong enough to unsettle. Because it challenges the belief that systems can fully protect what lies behind them. The film endured, yet its tone remained unusual within wartime storytelling. It does not celebrate dominance. It exposes vulnerability. And once audiences recognize how easily stability can be disrupted, the comfort of certainty begins to slip away. Number 5. The Cruel Sea, 1953. The ocean stretches endlessly. Beneath it, an unseen threat waits. A British naval crew hunts submarines through long stretches of fear and fatigue. Victory is uncertain. Survival feels temporary. The film captures war as endurance rather than triumph. Then comes the moment that defines everything. A ship is sunk. Survivors struggle in the water. The captain faces a decision that feels impossible. Stop to rescue them and risk the entire crew. Move on and leave them behind. The choice is made. Duty overrides instinct. Lives are lost in silence. This is where the film cuts deepest. It presents command as burden rather than authority. Decisions are not heroic. They are calculated sacrifices. The cost is carried long after the moment passes. There is no celebration, only memory. For audiences used to clear victories, this ambiguity unsettles. It suggests that war demands compromises that cannot be justified cleanly. That idea sits uneasily within official narratives. The film remained respected, yet carefully framed, because it honors service while revealing the emotional damage beneath it. That balance makes it powerful and quietly dangerous. It invites viewers to see leadership not as strength alone, but as a weight that never truly lifts. Number 4. Ice Cold in Alex, 1958. The desert stretches like an endless test. Heat presses down on every decision. A small group struggles across North Africa with one simple goal: reach safety. That is all. No grand victory. No strategic turning point. Just survival measured in miles and moments. The film strips war down to its barest form. Exhaustion replaces courage. Doubt replaces certainty. Every step feels like it could be the last. The men are not symbols of glory. They are fragile. They argue. They break. They keep moving because stopping means disappearing. At its center lies a quiet tension. Leadership here is not about commanding armies. It is about holding people together when everything inside them is falling apart. The film suggests that survival is not driven by orders, but by human connection. That idea subtly undermines the traditional image of structured authority. Now place this against a broader military narrative shaped by confidence and control. Stories like this do not reinforce that image. They expose its limits. They show that war often reduces even the strongest systems to something uncertain and unpredictable. What followed was not rejection but restraint. The film never received the kind of aggressive push that more heroic stories enjoyed across the Atlantic, because a war reduced to survival does not inspire dominance. It invites reflection, and reflection is not always what institutions want audiences to carry home. Number 3. The Dam Busters, 1955. Precision defines everything here. Engineers calculate. Pilots prepare. A mission is designed to strike with surgical accuracy. On the surface, it feels like the perfect war story. Planning leads to execution. Execution leads to success. Control is absolute. But beneath that surface lies a quieter reality. The film celebrates innovation, yet avoids the full weight of consequence. Dams collapse, water surges. The human cost remains distant. This selective framing creates a tension that becomes more visible over time. As military storytelling evolved, especially in the United States, questions began to shift. Victory alone was no longer enough. Audiences started asking what that victory meant, what was destroyed, who paid the price. A film that presents success without fully confronting its aftermath begins to feel incomplete. That discomfort does not erupt into open criticism. It settles into something subtler, a reevaluation, a hesitation to fully embrace the narrative as definitive truth. Because modern perspectives demand more than clean outcomes, they demand accountability. Hollywood responded in a familiar way. The film remained respected, yet its global positioning softened, not erased, not attacked, just carefully balanced within a changing landscape. Because once audiences begin to look beyond the mission and into its consequences, the story shifts. And when the story shifts, the certainty that once defined it starts to fade. Number 2. Tunes of Glory, 1960. The war is over. The uniforms remain. Inside a Scottish regiment, something far more dangerous begins to unfold. This is not a battle against an external enemy. It is a collision between two commanding officers, who represent completely different versions of authority. One leads through instinct and earned loyalty. The other enforces order through rigid discipline and inherited status. The tension builds slowly, then it cracks. What emerges is a portrait of leadership that feels unstable at its core. Rank does not guarantee competence. Control does not guarantee respect. The film suggests something deeply uncomfortable. The greatest threat to a unit may come from within its own command structure. For audiences conditioned to trust the chain of command, this idea lands hard. It implies that authority can fracture under pressure, that personalities and pride can override judgment. When viewed through a broader Cold War mindset, this becomes even more sensitive. Military strength depends on the belief that leadership is reliable. Remove that belief, and the entire structure begins to feel uncertain. The film did not need confrontation to create unease. Its reputation moved quietly, admired for performances, yet approached with caution, because it raises a question that lingers long after the credits end. What happens when the people in charge are not as stable as the system demands? That question does not disappear. It waits, and once it settles into the audience, it becomes difficult to ignore. Number 1. The Bridge on the River, Kwai, 1957. A bridge rises in the jungle, built by prisoners, commanded by pride. What begins as a story of survival transforms into something far more unsettling. A British officer becomes obsessed with completing the structure not for the enemy, but for the idea of discipline itself. The film challenges the very definition of duty. Is obedience still honorable when it serves the opposition? Is pride still noble when it blinds judgment? These questions unfold slowly until the line between strength and delusion disappears. For military institutions built on obedience, this narrative strikes at the foundation. It suggests that discipline without reflection can lead to self-destruction, that loyalty to structure can override common sense. These are not comfortable ideas, especially in a world where command depends on unquestioned execution. The film achieved massive success, yet its implications never sat easily. Behind the acclaim, there remained a quiet tension. Because it does not simply tell a war story, it exposes the psychological trap inside it. The belief that following orders is always the right path. That belief is powerful. It holds systems together. But once a film reveals how easily it can be twisted, the audience begins to see it differently. And when that shift happens, the story stops being about the past. It becomes a reflection of every system that depends on unquestioned command. These films were never truly forgotten. They were simply pushed aside because they asked questions no system wants answered. If one of these stories changed how you see war, then the mission worked. Watch again, think deeper, and tell us which film unsettled you the most.